Before even starting, I want to just highlight something that we're going at this whole decentralized network design approach very pragmatic, and you'll see that in a second. So we're going at it very iteratively and so on, so just be prepared for that versus theoretical. Hello. The mission, so when we talk internally about the product and what we're doing, we're coming always back to the mission, like why do we actually do what we do? Because we think any system that we're building actually should support this. And really for us, the mission of Centrifuge is to create a new financial system for the global supply chain to foster economic opportunity everywhere. And that is really important. This part is we're really building an open network for any business to join, any service provider to join, but this is something that we keep in mind all the time. So we're building a new generation of B2B applications for the financial supply chain. Our goals are to have no reliance on a centralized party, so nobody's sitting there owning all the data or deciding who can join or not. Really for any business of any size or any service provider who wants to provide services to these businesses. And in the end, something that we call the global business graph. You'll get to hear a little bit more about that in a second, what that actually is. So let's start how Centrifuge actually works today. So what we've built over the last year, and actually people are using as of now. So the financial supply chain involves companies. So in our example, Tire Inc. and Big Car. And Tire Inc. is selling tires to Big Car. They might exchange purchase orders and so on. At some point, Tire Inc. wants to get paid. So Tire Inc. sends an invoice to Big Car. And they do that with the Centrifuge network. So this is a peer-to-peer network. Basically, they're communicating directly with each other. And we have something we call a Centrifuge node. Tire Inc. has one, Big Car has one. They can run that themselves. They can use a hosted version, something like Infura, so to say. And these nodes, what they do is they send the document, this invoice, over through the peer-to-peer network to the other side and attach a signature to the state that is being exchanged. So at this point, this is an immutable signed document. Big Car does the same thing on the other side. And that's kind of the basic ping pong for all of the transactions flowing through Centrifuge. In this case, it's an invoice. We also support other kind of document types, purchase orders, company data, and so on. But let's stick with the invoice because that's also important then for later. So that's a peer-to-peer network, completely off-chain, so to say. But we do use Ethereum. And on Ethereum, we have something called identities. So Tire Inc. and Big Car have an identity, so a Centrifuge ID, as we call it, which is used to uniquely identify each other on the peer-to-peer network. So Tire Inc.'s Centrifuge node looks up the identity. These guys verify the keys and the signatures attached to that. Another component of Centrifuge is anchors, as we call them. So basically, each of these transactions, as documents get passed around, they get signed and hashed, and the hash of the document is also getting stored on Ethereum. And what that allows us to do is any point later in time, basically take that fingerprint of the document and then do stuff with that. You can validate single fields of a state of an invoice, like what was the amount, what was the status, who agreed to the status, and so on. And lastly, what they can also do, they can start granting access to this invoice to others. So that's really where service providers like funders, insurance providers, and so on come into play. So you start seeing kind of forming a star of different participants, so to say, in this transaction around that, which is always verifiable through Ethereum as the public blockchain. And when we say we can do stuff with these anchors, is that basically anybody can start minting NFTs that represent statuses of these documents. So Tire Inc. can actually mint an NFT, so a token that represents an unpaid invoice. And that will come into play later when we talk about invoice financing. Basically, you make this previously off-chain illiquid asset liquid by creating a tokenized representation on Ethereum, and then you can do whatever you want with that. So just an ERC 721 NFT. So far, so good? Yes?
Is the total invoice data stored at the stored on chain?
Good point. So the invoice data is really only exchanged between Tire Inc. and Bitcar. So they both have a copy of that with the signatures and kind of the state transition, so to say, of this invoice. So first they send it over as an unpaid invoice, then they approve it, and so on. But the data itself actually doesn't go on chain. So that's where the anchors come in. So basically a hash is generated of the invoice. More technically, it's not just like a hash of the blob, but we create a Merkle tree out of all of the single fields in an invoice. So basically just the root hash is stored on it.
Many fields.
Say it again?
So it's one anchor per field?
No, it's one anchor per document. So you can think of like the invoice amount, the currency, and all these kind of things as leaves of a Merkle tree. And then there's one root hash that is getting stored here. And what that allows us to do then is later on, if you want to mint an NFT, you can provide Merkle proofs for a single field to mint an NFT. So you can mint an NFT that undisputably references an unpaid invoice or an invoice in US dollars or whatever it is. So without revealing the whole data on chain. Okay?
Question. Would you mind telling us more about the identities side that you said you store on Ethereum or you leverage Ethereum?
Yeah. So these centrifuge IDs, as we call them, we're loosely using ERC 725 as an identity standard. Loosely. Like we're not trying to be an identity solution, also to say, but we just need a way to have keys listed that then can be used for signing documents or finding each other on the peer-to-peer network. And for the peer-to-peer transactions, we're actually using libp2p. So that's just kind of the networking layer.
So is it really just a peer-to-peer network? It's stateless, basically?
Correct. So the state is really stored in the different parts. You can think of that, of each document, so to say, as its little blockchain where it's different signatures getting attached and then transitions all the way.
So authenticated data structure, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, you can think about it like
Would
that.
you say the anchors operates like oracles?
More like a notary. Like you take a stamp of that document and you have the anchors. Okay, last one. Yeah.
How do the anchors reach agreement on past invoices? Let's say there's a new anchor who sees some invoice from 2 years ago, but all the anchors from 2 years ago are gone.
So the anchors are not disappearing. The anchors stay there. Basically, each time there is a transaction happening here, one of these nodes publishes the root hash of the newly agreed state. And that just basically publishes mean it just pushes the transaction. There's like an ID of the document and the hash of the document at that point in time. And on-chain, you don't really know what this root hash is for, but the document itself basically has a pointer to which anchor it used. So when these folks later exchange or add a new collaborator like a funder, they can basically, by getting access to this off-chain data, look at the anchors and can validate the off-chain state. Let's continue here. Let's talk about NFTs, because that's a big part of what we're doing. So with Centrifuge OS, the users can tokenize documents and the specific states. So you can mint undisputably an unpaid invoice, for example. And with kind of that off-chain exchange, the participants can verify the data that is behind an NFT, so to say. And the first NFT that we're supporting is actually an unpaid invoice NFT. And you'll see that, it's used for invoice financing. We're going into the use case in a second. So Centrifuge OS today uses Ethereum mainnet as a blockchain. So identities, anchors, NFTs, they all live there. It works. And there's an ecosystem of other applications, like you heard probably about DeFi, right? Decentralized finance, ecosystem of other projects that can use ERC 721s or we can interact with. But it's also very slow and it's very expensive, right? And actually the price, you don't never know, like what's the price of ETH? And when we talk about our token later, that will become important. But it works on mainnet. And Centrifuge OS today is kind of that first level of the business graph, right? You have this invoice and you have the collaborators around that. So it's kind of the first leg of a graph, so to say, the relationships that are starting to form there. Yeah, multiple parties view on a single document. So back to kind of our first point, fostering economic opportunity everywhere. So anybody can join this, anybody can use it. You can just download a node, create an identity, and start sending documents around. It can be invoices, orders, or others. So how does a token come into this? So right now, as I said, Ethereum is slow and expensive. So if you want to anchor many documents, so we have an initiative together with BASF, a large chemical company. They have something they call Network of Networks, an initiative. And you can think about how many invoices a BASF exchanges every year and what they want to do with that. So for these kind of scales, Ethereum mainnet is not the best. So we'll talk a bit about the Centrifuge chain later. How can we make that faster and cheaper? And also, earlier you saw the different parties like Tire Inc. and Big Car and the others. The first version of Centrifuge is actually interactive. So all parties need to be online to sign a document or validate a document state. So the question is, what happens if a node goes offline and there's a collaborator? How do they receive an update at a later point? How can we incentivize people to be online or somebody taking over like signature authority? And lastly, the business graph traversal. Right now, both parties involved or all parties involved have an incentive to collaborate because they're on one document. But when we want to traverse a graph to prove relationships and so on, maybe not everybody has an immediate incentive to be online or to answer a question truthfully. So how can a token help with that? But actually on mainnet today, we launched without a token. So we had a lot of discussion if we want to include the token mechanics from day one in the product. And we decided not to. We also want to prove if the system is inherently useful for our users from day one. Like nobody's going to join Centrifuge to send an invoice to receive a token. No, they join that to exchange invoices and then receive financing, right? So how can the token support the actual network? Keeping complexity low, of course. And businesses or the businesses using Centrifuge today, they don't really care about decentralized governance or anything like that. They want to make sure that that stuff works for them. And then we have partners slowly that we want to fold into supporting the network over time. So fun fact, we were actually, so my co-founder Martin was actually at the first token engineer meetup here in Berlin. So about a year.
April 2018, wasn't it?
So about a year ago. And I asked him for the slides so they can know what he actually talked about. And he said there were no slides. At that point, it was just whiteboarding and just getting feedback. But what have we been doing since then? Well, we started, we published a white paper in June of last year. It included all the things, sidechain, these keepers, decentralized governance, and all this kind of stuff, kind of a broad vision. But then really we kind of narrowed it down and really looked at what's the first use case that we can tackle. And that's when I meant earlier with the pragmatic approach, like really what's something that we can deliver. We had our first users. We had Cassidy join us in August of last year to really focus on the token mechanics and how can we incentivize the network besides just using it. October of last year, we actually had our public testnet and we open sourced the client and the protocol and kind of how do we do the hashing of documents and so on. And April, that's now, we have our stuff running on mainnet and we're slowly giving that access, basically the contract addresses and these kind of things out to our first users to really run this with real money, because actually behavior changes when there is real money versus like fake DAI or whatever. Like when there's real money at stake, it's quite different. So that's kind of how Centrifuge works today. Yes?
What do you guys do to publish your NFT mechanism? Do you use like Open Zeppelin? Are the contracts upgradable on mainnet or?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, those two.
Yeah, so yes, we use Open Zeppelin for like the base contract for the ERC 721. There's actually, we have a technical paper of how we allow this minting to happen, like with the proof submission that you can prove this is truly like an unpaid invoice. We wrote that ourselves, kind of the user mintable approach. And then actually we use also Zeppelin OS, which is the upgradability mechanism that Zeppelin built so that we can upgrade contracts on the fly.
And last question, have you checked out POA?
POA.network?
Yeah.
You mean as a like a side chain?
Yep.
Yeah, we like.
Speed things up and
Yeah, we like the folks at POA a lot. We have talked multiple times. At this point, we went back to, we can actually make this usable on mainnet today. There are many benefits of using POA network today. It works. It's Ethereum. We can deploy our EVM bytecode, so to say, on their chain. But it's also a design consideration. We have very specific features that we want on this chain, right? Identities, anchoring, and some NFTs. Do we actually need a full-blown like EVM on a centrifuge chain, or would we be better served in the long run to build something like, let's say, on Polkadot or Substrate or something like that? But we have talked for sure.
yeah, they don't have an NFT bridge either. So,
They have an ERC20 bridge in both directions. I don't think they have an ERC721. And if we would build a bridge, we could also build it more centralized in the beginning and then decentralize that later on. Yeah.
So I'm not sure about why is this working at all, and what's the purpose? I have an invoice, it's unpaid. Is it some sort of I make a security out of it and sell it to the market so that now the debt is actually paid by the market but not by the supplier, or what's that for actually, this coin?
Yeah.
Is it collateralized? Is it over collateralized? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah. Just to be clear, you said that coin. So the NFT is not like a coin per se, right? It's uniquely representing that one invoice. But everything, it's
tradable. So
it's assignable. Yes, you can, like you have a crypto kitty, right? I can send you my kitty, you can send him that kitty, and so on. Similar with an invoice or with this unpaid invoice. The things that you mentioned, like collateralizing a debt order, for example, or using this asset as collateral for a loan, that's exactly, when we talk about invoice financing, that's exactly what this is used for. So you can prove, I'm Philip, because I'm in Centrifuge, I send this invoice to Cassidy, we have this transaction history, and I can prove this is an unpaid invoice that Cassidy received, and she said she'll pay me in 90 days. And now I can do something with that. I can mint a token, I can use it as collateral, I can just give it to you over the counter and say, hey, here is this unpaid invoice, would you give me some money in advance?
So, and then the invoice gets paid, and somebody has to burn this NFT token afterwards?
Yeah, so the protocol itself doesn't really care what you do with the NFT itself. If you would use a Dharma debt order, for example, that debt order would be resolved when you repay, so to say, the loan, and then the NFT gets released to me in the example that I earlier said. We thought about allowing kind of burning this token as part of the standard for right now, but we decided to leave that one layer up in kind of the application, because you'll see also there's different ways how you can finance this invoice. You could like create a refungible token, or you can take this invoice and sell like portions of it to somebody else, or you can do many things. So we wanted to keep it as simple as possible in the first throw, so to say. Yes.
Sorry for being late.
Just from my understanding, practically, if I get an unpaid, or if I issue unpaid invoice, there is actually somebody who is buying some stuff from me or whatever. Yeah, so I issue invoice with my account number, and now I'm going to sell this invoice, but I still get the money. So is not a big gap for fraud and these type of fraudulent activities involved with this. So how do I make sure? Because the invoice is bound to my account, to account of my business. There is no information for third parties actually on this account. So I can just sell the invoice. I can just get the invoice paid and sell it. So what's the sense of it? I mean, so for the other parties, they don't have any way to enforce to retrieve this money from me.
It depends on what the legal construct is that you build around it. So this is not
invoice, same as invoice.
Yeah, and that is something that's getting done today, right? So they actually can factor an invoice. You can go somewhere and sell your invoice. It's just a very cumbersome process because is this paper that I'm getting actually real invoice? Did the other person really receive it? When are they really going to pay? And these kind of things. So for the underwriting of that risk, the funder in this case actually can use reliable data where they can really be sure that Cassidy actually is the counterparty and Cassidy agreed to the state. So that makes the risk much lower. The centrifuge itself does not do the underwriting itself. We work with funding providers who do the underwriting, and there's still, it's not trustless in a sense like whatever like an exchange is. It's not trustless like the underwriter still evaluates the invoice owner, the customer, the invoice itself, and then makes a funding decision based on that. And then also that depends on the jurisdiction, right? Invoice factoring works differently in Germany compared to Spain or whatever. Yeah.
I have a question to this last note on what happened during the last year. So since you have found a, let's say, traditional digital company beforehand, what would you say, what is different? Because well, obviously you can write down a lot of great ideas and you seem to have cut down or let's say postponed a lot of the things you or the ideas you had 1 year before. If you compare the work, 12-month work on Centrifuge to your last startup, what's the difference building a blockchain startup?
Yeah, just for point of reference, so we had a company before in a similar space, financial supply chain for many years, that was completely centralized, no blockchain involved. That's what you're referring to. What's different? It's like we're trying to design a product that's inherently useful for somebody, so creating a market for the product that we're building. At the same time, we are engineering the incentive and the economy that supports this product. At the same time, Ethereum is really slow. We're using stuff like libp2p, which has not been around. So like it's kind of a lot of uncertainty layers being put on top of each other. And that's also why we came back to it's like, okay, we know there are features that require a decentralized mechanism or a token economy that we want, but what is actually the most simple thing that we can start with and really start proving out certain things instead of building this whole thing and then it's like give it over to the users and then hope that they use it and the token economy works and Ethereum scales or Polkadot actually launched at the time they say they will. So that's kind of, I think it's more uncertainties stacked on top. One thing that we contemplated about a year and a half ago when we first started talking about Centrifuge is if we should do an ICO or not. And I'm super happy that we didn't. So we raised traditional venture capital. Actually, we share investors also with Ocean. Blue Yard is one of them here in Berlin. And that was super awesome because they really stick with us. We don't have to answer to thousands of folks or get a risk of regulatory issues because we sold a token or anything like that. You were first.
With your, in regards to your comment about it being not being a completely trustless system, would you say there are parameters that you could use to enable some kind of risk scoring with respect to the invoicing?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the transactions that are happening, right, so that notary service, so to say, that's on a per transaction basis. But basically you can start forming proofs that involve a volume of transactions over the last year where you can prove I did business with all of these folks and this is my network and this is the value that I exchanged and these amounts and so on. So there's definitely a reputation that can be coming in there. Yeah.
And would you think the invoicer would be willingly give this information, or is there a way to access this? How would you get around to getting all these transactions? Because this is sensitive information.
Yeah. So, okay, then I'm not saying that another entity comes in and gets access to all of this information. It's more each participant can publish their portion of the data or their portion of the transaction history without any chance of falsifying that information because you can always get back to this anchor, this hash of each of the transactions. So you can say, hey, you want to provide all of your transaction history, and I can trust, or I can verify that this is truly correct. And we're only going through invoices. You can do the same thing for purchase orders. We're talking warehouse receipts.
And is this something you're planning to do as well?
For us at this point, it's much more about the first version that we launched is that protocol, peer-to-peer, Ethereum, and then we're focusing on the invoicing use case as the first one, because the reputation only works if you have transactions. So how do you get transactions? We're actually focusing on that as the first thing. And you?
How are you as a company going to make money?
Yeah, twofold. So there will be a token at some point where we as a team, and you talk about the distribution as well, like Dev Fund.
No, I don't talk
Okay.
about it.
Okay.
But I can.
Yeah, I'll just in one sentence, and then you can pick it up later if it's still unclear. That we're contemplating different mechanisms to reward us as the network is getting used, so that we have funds to operate, and then also we're collaborating with some of the funders, for example, to enable products for them where that's not on the protocol level, but on an application level, where we can participate and then kind of seed information or contribution back to the network. Yeah.
The data availability problem, because data are actually outside of every decentralized system here. Is it somehow motivated or enforced in the token design that the data is available forever because somebody profits from this service?
Mm-hmm.
How is this going to work?
We'll leave that for the later session then. That's absolutely relevant. Cool. Last one, I think, and then we have to go to the next portion. Yeah.
I'm a little bit concerned about if you have business relation about the privacy. So are this information about the supplier and the type of invoice, the type of transaction, and details informed by all people on the network? Because in a centralized network, you want to make sure that you don't share the information. So it's almost already a risk if you share it with a central partner, actually financial partner. So you try to avoid it. I never did it yet. So actually, I don't do factoring. I never use it because it doesn't make any sense for me. But I do have to admit that there might be some business that makes sense. But in this case, the participating partner, they know all information because they need to evaluate the business. So 2 questions. If they are actually scattered particular partners actually financing it, if they don't have information, they might not be able to evaluate the risk of the transaction and whether they want to support it. If they have all the information, it might be not very favorable to the business partner, original business partner.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of privacy, let's keep these guys away. So Tire Inc., Big Car, they need to know all the invoice information, right? Line items, tax information, attachments, PDFs, or whatever. But otherwise, they couldn't do business. What each of them can do, if they grant access to a third party, they can grant access to only very specific parts of this invoice. And when I mentioned earlier, we're creating this Merkle tree so that you can basically share specific fields only that are relevant to the specific use case without revealing anything else about the document, but still being able to prove the authenticity of the single field that you're sharing. But that's very application specific, so to say, what do you want to share, what not.